Imagine being so broke that your entire wedding budget is $17.32. That's exactly how much Phoenix had in her bank account the morning of her wedding day. No flowers, no music, no reception, just a borrowed space and the hope that love would be enough. But then something happened that defied every law of probability. The world's most famous violinist was driving through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, got lost, heard something that made him stop his car, and walked into the most humble wedding ceremony you could imagine. What happened next didn't just change Phoenix and River's wedding day. It set off a chain reaction that would transform the lives of an entire community in ways that are still unfolding today. And here's the part that will blow your mind. This incredible story almost never happened because of a broken radio and a 22-year-old's embarrassment. Hey, before we dive into this unbelievable true story, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and your age. And if stories like this give you hope in humanity, smash that subscribe button because we've got more incredible real-life miracles coming your way. The wedding was planned for the middle of the afternoon because that was the only time the community center space was free. There was no hired hall, no hired band, no sound equipment. What there was: a small courtyard, some chairs borrowed from neighbors, and a sincere attempt to celebrate something important with the little they had available. Phoenix, 25 years old, wore simple clothing, not chosen from childhood dreams, but from what was possible. River, 27, wore his best shirt over him. Neither spoke about lack, only about beginning together. The decision not to have a band wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was necessity. The saved money barely covered the documents, food prepared by family members, and some handmade decorations. For music, someone had brought an old radio that worked when it wanted to. This didn't seem to bother the guests. Most knew the couple's situation and understood that this wedding wasn't about appearances. Meanwhile, in another part of Philadelphia, André Rieu was returning from an official commitment. The day had been long, predictable, and organized down to the smallest detail. In the car, in silence, he observed the city passing through the window, feeling a fatigue that didn't come from the body but from repetition. At some point, he asked the driver to change the route. There was no urgency, no explanation. He just didn't want to follow the usual route. The route brought the car to less busy streets, far from planned events and places where he was usually recognized. It was during this movement that André heard something else. It wasn't professional music, no clear sound. It was an out-of-tune violin mixed with voices trying to sing along. It didn't sound like rehearsal or presentation. It sounded like effort. André asked to stop. Getting out of the car, he didn't yet know he was about to enter a wedding. He also didn't know that this simple ceremony, without a band and without expectations, would become one of the most memorable moments for everyone present. What he knew was only that someone was trying to make music without resources, and that alone deserved attention. The driver, Pavel, looked at him questioningly. This wasn't the first time André had asked for an unexpected stop, but usually it was for coffee or a brief conversation with a fan. This time there was something different in his look. Pavel parked the car discreetly and waited. André walked slowly toward the sound. As he got closer, it became clearer that this wasn't an organized event. The music stopped and started again with pauses that weren't musical, but necessary. Someone was trying to find a melody with what was available. The courtyard came into view. André paused for a moment at the entrance, observing without entering. There were about 30 people, maybe a bit less. Some stood, others sat in plastic chairs. In the middle stood Phoenix and River hand in hand, listening to someone speaking words he couldn't hear from his position. This was the moment when André had to make a decision. He could return to the car, forget the scene, and continue with his day. Or he could take a step forward and become part of something that had absolutely nothing to do with him. The choice seemed simple, but the consequences would reach further than anyone could imagine at that moment. André took the step forward. No one noticed him in the first seconds. Attention was focused on the couple and on the words being spoken. The music had paused, and there was only the sound of voices and distant traffic from the street. He walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but alert. A young woman at the edge of the group saw him first. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She looked at the person next to her, doubting whether she should interrupt. André gave a subtle gesture, a hand lightly raised, asking not to draw attention. The woman nodded and remained quiet. The ceremony continued. The person speaking had a warm voice full of sincere emotion. They weren't rehearsed words, but words that came from experience. Phoenix and River looked at each other, their eyes moist but their smiles firm. This was their moment. Regardless of what was lacking around them, Then the music stopped again. Someone tried to adjust the radio, turned knobs, but the sound didn't return. Uncomfortable silence followed. Some guests moved restlessly. Phoenix bit her lip. River tightened his grip on her hand. This was exactly what they had feared. That simplicity would be seen as lack instead of choice. André observed all this from his position at the edge. He saw the tension, the attempts to save the situation, the silent shame that spread across some faces. It was at that moment that something in him shifted. This was no longer just accidental observation. This called for action. He waited until the officiant took a pause to deal with the technical problem. Then, with a movement so natural it almost went unnoticed, André walked further inside. This time he didn't walk to the edge but toward the center. His presence was immediately felt. Phoenix saw him first. A strange man, well-dressed, older, with a face that seemed familiar but she couldn't immediately place. Her first reaction was protection. This was their day, their space. River followed her gaze and instinctively stepped a bit forward. André stopped at an appropriate distance. He spoke with a voice that was clear but not loud. He apologized for the interruption, explained that he had heard the music while passing and had become curious. He asked if everything was all right, if they needed help. The silence that followed was charged. No one knew how to react. Was this a joke, a test, an unexpected visit from someone they should know? It was Sterling, a young guest at 22 years old, who broke the silence. He whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That's André Rieu." The words hung in the air like a question and an answer at the same time. The reaction was immediate, but divided. Some people grabbed for their phones, others just stared. Willow, a neighbor at 47 who had helped with the preparation, put her hand on her heart. Sage, Phoenix's mother at 54, became pale. Phoenix felt her world tilting. André Rieu here, at their simple wedding without everything. The shame she had tried to suppress came back in full force. She looked around at the plastic chairs, the handmade decorations, the silent radio. What must he think? But André's next words changed the direction of the moment. He said he hadn't come to judge or to observe as an outsider. He had come because he had heard something that had caught his attention, something genuine, and if they didn't mind, he would like to stay, even if just for a few minutes. River found his voice. He thanked André, said he was welcome, but also explained that they had nothing special to offer. No music, no entertainment, only a simple ceremony. André smiled. It was a smile without mockery, without pity. It was a smile of understanding. He said that sometimes the simplest ceremonies were the most memorable, not because of what they had, but because of why they happened. The words were simple, but their effect was profound. The tension began to melt. People relaxed somewhat. Phoenix felt tears coming, but this time not from shame, from something else. Something she couldn't immediately name. The ceremony resumed, but now with new energy. The words became more powerful, the gestures more meaningful. André remained at the edge, not as a spectator, but as a silent participant. And then, when the moment for exchanging vows came, the radio definitively stopped working. It was in this absolute silence that André made a movement. He didn't walk to the radio. He walked to Sterling, the young man who had recognized him. He asked in a whisper if there was an instrument nearby. Sterling's eyes went wide. He nodded and ran to a corner of the courtyard. What he brought back was an old violin hidden in a worn case. The instrument wasn't in perfect condition, but it was there. André took it in his hands, with a tenderness that made clear this wasn't about the quality of the instrument, but about what could be done with it. He tuned the strings quickly, tested the sound. The courtyard was now completely silent, everyone waiting. And then, without announcement, without ceremony, André began to play. The first notes filled the space with a beauty that no one had expected. It wasn't a grand composition, no showpiece. It was a simple melody, suitable for a wedding, for a beginning, for hope. Phoenix's tears now flowed freely. River held her hand so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The music lasted maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. Time had no meaning anymore. When André stopped, the silence that followed was sacred. No one applauded immediately. They just stood there, absorbing what they had just experienced. Then slowly the applause began. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was sincere, deep, grateful. André bowed lightly and returned the violin to Sterling. He said nothing more. He didn't need to say anything either. But this wasn't the end of his involvement. This was just the beginning, because what no one yet knew was that André had made a decision during the playing. A decision that would change the course of this wedding and the lives of Phoenix and River in ways they would only fully understand months later. After the music, the atmosphere in the courtyard changed completely. The tension that had been there, the uncertainty, the shame, all melted away. In its place came a feeling of community, of shared experience. The guests began to move more freely. Conversations became lively, and even Phoenix and River seemed relaxed in a way that had previously seemed impossible. André accepted a plastic chair that was placed next to a makeshift table. He sat like any other guest, without expecting or accepting special treatment. People began cautiously approaching, not intrusively but curiously. They asked questions not about his career or fame, but about simple things. How he had heard the music, why he had stopped, what he thought of their small ceremony. André answered each question with genuine attention. He listened more than he spoke, nodded understandingly, smiled at the right moments. For the guests who were used to subtle rejections and closed doors, this alone was a revelation. Someone of his status who actually seemed interested in their stories. Willow, the neighbor, brought a plate of homemade cookies. She apologized for the simplicity, but André took one and complimented the taste in a way that made clear he wasn't being polite, but honest. Willow blushed and hurried away, but with a smile that transformed her face. Sage, Phoenix's mother, was more cautious. She observed André from a distance, her maternal instincts at full strength. She had seen too many years of struggle and disappointment to easily trust in sudden goodness. But even she couldn't deny that there was something genuine in the way this man behaved. It was during one of these conversations that the first unexpected turn occurred. Phoenix, encouraged by River, approached André. They wanted to thank him, let him know how much his presence and music meant. But when she began to speak, she stopped halfway, overwhelmed by emotion. André stood up and gave her a moment to recover. Then, with a soft voice, he asked her something no one had expected. He asked about her dreams, about what she wanted to do with her life beyond this moment. The question was so direct, so personal, that Phoenix didn't know how to answer at first. Eventually, she told him about nursing, about how she had always wanted to help, heal, contribute, but how the costs, the time, the simple reality of survival had made it impossible. She spoke without self-pity, only with the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to adjust expectations to possibilities. André listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. He asked another question, one that completely changed the direction of the conversation. He asked if she would be willing to try if the financial barrier were removed. Phoenix's breath caught. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? But before the conversation could continue, it was interrupted by commotion on the other side of the courtyard. Sterling, the young man who had brought the violin, had accidentally knocked over a table, causing glasses and plates to fall to the ground. There was no real damage, but the disruption broke the moment between André and Phoenix. André excused himself and walked to where Sterling stood, his face red with embarrassment. Instead of being irritated, André helped him clean up, his movements calm and methodical. He made a joke that made Sterling laugh, and the tension disappeared. While they cleaned up, André spoke softly with Sterling. He asked about the violin, where it came from, how long Sterling had played. Sterling explained that it was a family piece, passed down, but rarely used, because no one really knew how to play it. André nodded understandingly, and then made a suggestion that left Sterling speechless. He offered to connect Sterling with a teacher, someone who could help him master the instrument if he wanted. It wasn't a grand promise, no lifelong commitment, just opening a door, creating a possibility. Sterling could hardly believe what he was hearing. But while this conversation was taking place, another situation was developing at the edge of the courtyard. River had received a phone call, his face tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he immediately sought Phoenix. His expression told her something was wrong. It turned out there was a problem with their housing. The landlord had called to say that water damage had been discovered and that they had to leave the apartment the next day for repairs. Indefinite time, and no alternative accommodation was offered. The timing couldn't be worse. Here they were on their wedding day, suddenly confronted with the possibility of being homeless. The joy of the ceremony, the warmth of André's presence, everything threatened to be overshadowed by this new reality. Phoenix's face went pale. River tried to stay calm, but his concern was clear. Sage, who had followed the conversation, immediately came to them, her own worries forgotten in light of this new crisis. André, although on the other side of the courtyard, noticed the change in atmosphere. He saw the group coming together, the urgent whispered voices, the tense faces. He excused himself from Sterling and walked toward them. When he joined the group, the first reaction was defensive. This was a private problem. Nothing that a stranger, however famous or friendly, should burden. But André's question was simple. "Can I help?" River shook his head, began to say it was okay, that they would figure it out. But Sage interrupted him. With a maternal directness that allowed no discussion, she explained the situation to André. The water damage, the eviction, the timing. She ended with a sigh, not asking for help, just acknowledging the reality. André was silent for a moment, his face thoughtful. Then he did something no one expected. He took out a phone and made a brief call. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When he hung up, he addressed River and Phoenix. He explained that he had a friend with real estate properties in the city. There was a small apartment that was currently empty, not luxurious but functional. If they were interested, it would be available for them, temporarily at a more than reasonable rent. It wasn't free. He emphasized that point, but it was possible. The silence that followed was absolute. Phoenix stared at André as if he had spoken in another language. River opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sage put a hand on Phoenix's shoulder, her grip tight. This was no small gesture anymore. This was substantial help, the kind that changed lives, and it came from a man they had first met less than an hour ago. The incredibility of it was overwhelming, but before anyone could react, before anyone could accept or refuse or even fully understand, something else happened. Pavel, the driver, appeared at the edge of the courtyard. He gestured to André discreetly, urgency in his gesture. André excused himself and walked to Pavel. The conversation between them was short but intense. Pavel's facial expression was concerned. He pointed to his watch, said something about a schedule, a next commitment. André listened, nodded, but seemed hesitant. The guests observed this from their distance, realizing that their magical interlude was nearing its end. André had other places to be, other obligations. The real world was calling him back. The wedding would return to its simple reality, and this strange, beautiful interruption would become just a memory. But André turned around and walked back to where Phoenix, River, and Sage stood. His face was firm, determined. He spoke with a clarity that left no doubt. He had to leave, but his offer stood. They could contact him through the number he would leave behind. The decision was theirs. He wrote quickly on a napkin, folded it, and gave it to River. Then, without further ceremony, without dramatic farewell, he bowed lightly to Phoenix and River, thanked the company and walked to where Pavel was waiting. The courtyard watched in silence as André Rieu, the world-famous musician, left this simple wedding as he had come, unexpectedly without fanfare, leaving an impact that no one could fully comprehend. But what no one knew, what even André himself hadn't fully realized yet, was that this accidental encounter would create ripples that would reach much further than this single day. The decisions made in the next hours and days would shape the lives of Phoenix and River in ways that had yet to unfold. The car drove away, and the courtyard was left in a strange silence. It wasn't the silence from before André's arrival, charged with discomfort and limitation. This was a different kind of silence, full of possibility and disbelief. The guests looked at each other, seeking confirmation that what they had just experienced had really happened. Phoenix held the folded napkin in her hands as if it were a precious artifact. River stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both still processing what had just occurred. Sage was the one who broke the silence. With a voice that trembled but was determined, she said they should sit, think, and make plans. The wedding wasn't over yet, but this new development required attention. The other guests, respecting the family's privacy, slowly began to resume their own conversations, but the topics had changed. No one spoke anymore about the simplicity of the ceremony or the lack of resources. They spoke about what they had seen, about the unexpected goodness of a stranger, about how an ordinary day had suddenly become extraordinary. Sterling sat apart, the violin still in his hands. He stared at the instrument with new eyes. André's offer to connect him with a teacher played over and over in his mind. He had always said he wanted to learn to play, but it had always been a vague ambition, something for the future. Now it was suddenly concrete, possible. The thought was both exciting and frightening. Willow approached him carefully. She had seen his conversation with André and was curious. She asked what the musician had said, what he had offered. Sterling told her, his voice full of awe. Willow nodded slowly, a smile forming on her face. She told him that opportunities like this didn't come often, that he would know what to do. Meanwhile, River had unfolded the napkin. On it was not only a phone number, but also a brief message. For the apartment, call tomorrow. For Phoenix's studies, talk to each other first. Choices are yours, AR. The words were simple, but the implications were enormous. Phoenix read the message over his shoulder, her breath caught at the mention of her studies. He hadn't just listened, he had remembered, he had understood. and he was offering not just help but respect for their autonomy. The choices were theirs. Sage read it too, and for the first time that day, tears began to flow down her cheeks. These weren't tears of shame or despair. These were tears of hope, of possibility. She embraced her daughter tightly, whispering that this was a sign that they should say yes, that they should seize this opportunity. But River was cautious. He was a practical man, shaped by years of disappointments and false promises. He wondered aloud why a man like André Rieu would do this for complete strangers. What was the catch? What were the expectations? It was a valid question, one that Phoenix also had. They didn't want to be naive, didn't want to be used or later disappointed, but as they read the message again, the simplicity of the words, the directness of the offer, it was difficult to find hidden motives. The wedding ceremony was technically over, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. The guests lingered, talking, laughing, sharing what food there was. There was a feeling of community that was rare in their usually more isolated lives. It was during this slow dispersal that another unexpected event occurred. A woman no one recognized appeared at the edge of the courtyard. She was well dressed, carried a professional demeanor. She asked for Phoenix and River, identified herself as an assistant to André's friend who managed the real estate. Her presence brought immediate tension. Was this real? Was the offer serious? Or was this some kind of misplaced joke? The woman, noticing their discomfort, was quick to reassure. She explained that André had called, explained the situation, and asked her to come by with details. She had keys for the apartment, contracts to review, and information about the rent. Everything was legal. Everything was real. Phoenix and River exchanged a look. This was the moment of decision. They could thank her and return to their familiar, difficult life, or they could take a leap into the unknown, trusting the words and actions of a man they barely knew. River asked the woman for a moment of privacy. She nodded and stepped back, respecting their need to deliberate. The couple, together with Sage, formed a small circle. They spoke in hushed tones, each expressing their concerns, hopes, and fears. Sage was the most vocal, pleading for acceptance. She said this was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime. River was more cautious, wanting more details, more guarantees. Phoenix was somewhere in between, torn between hope and fear. While they discussed, Willow observed from a distance. She had lived a life full of missed opportunities, always too afraid to jump, always too cautious. She didn't want Phoenix and River to make the same mistakes. She walked over to them, interrupted their conversation without apology. With a boldness that surprised her, Willow told them that fear was a bad advisor, that risks had to be taken, especially when they were presented with such sincerity. That not every offer was a trap, and not every good deed had a hidden motive. Her words had impact. Phoenix felt something in her shift. She looked at River, saw the conflict in his eyes, and made a decision. She would trust. They would trust, together. They called the assistant back. With voices that trembled but were determined, Phoenix and River said they were interested. They wanted to see the apartment, review the contracts, explore the possibility. It wasn't a full commitment, not yet, but it was a step forward. The assistant smiled, not triumphantly, but genuinely pleased. She suggested meeting the next day, visiting the apartment, discussing everything in detail. There was no pressure, no rush. André had made it clear this had to go at their pace. As the assistant left, a new silence fell over the courtyard. But this time, it was a satisfied silence, one that spoke of decisions made and futures beginning to form. The guests began to slowly leave, each taking time to congratulate Phoenix and River, not just on their wedding but on their courage. Sterling promised to call about the music teacher. Willow embraced Phoenix tightly, whispered encouragements. Others offered practical help with moving, with organizing, with whatever they needed. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Phoenix, River, and Sage remained alone in the courtyard. The plastic chairs were still scattered. The improvised decorations fluttered gently in the evening breeze. It was still a simple space, still a modest ceremony, but it no longer felt like lack. It felt like a beginning, an honest, authentic beginning of something they were building, not with money or show, but with love, faith, and unexpected help from a stranger who apparently saw more in them than they had seen in themselves. River carefully folded the napkin and put it in his pocket. Tomorrow they would call, see the apartment, take the next steps, but tonight in this courtyard on this day of their wedding, they let themselves just feel the moment. Phoenix leaned against River, her head on his shoulder. Sage sat next to them, her hand on her daughter's. None of them spoke. There were no words needed, but what they didn't know What still had to unfold was that the consequences of this day would stretch far into their future. Choices would be made, challenges would come, and whether they would prove worthy of the trust they had placed in André would only be answered in the coming months. The next morning began for Phoenix and River with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The housing problem that had seemed so urgent the day before was now intertwined with the possibility of a solution. They met the assistant as agreed at an address in a quiet neighborhood of the city. The apartment was small but clean, with sufficient light streaming through the windows. It wasn't luxury, but it was solid, safe, and infinitely better than the uncertainty they had been facing. The rental agreement was reasonable, the terms clear. There were no hidden costs, no unclear clauses. River read every word twice, searching for traps that weren't there. Phoenix walked through the space, her fingers touching the walls, the windowsills, as if she wanted to confirm it was real. Sage, who had come with them, stood in the kitchen and nodded approvingly. The assistant answered all their questions with patience. She explained that André had indeed made contact, that the owner, an old friend, was willing to help under these conditions. There was no expectation of repayment other than reasonable rent. No future favors, no publicity, no obligations. After an hour of discussion, of doubt and confirmation, Phoenix and River signed the contract. Their hands trembled slightly as they did so, but their decision was firm. This was the right step. As the assistant left, promising to help with the move if needed, the trio remained in their new home. They sat on the floor because there was no furniture yet, and looked at each other with a mix of disbelief and beginning hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With help from friends and neighbors, they moved their modest possessions to the new apartment. The process was exhausting, but exhilarating. Every box unpacked felt like confirmation of their new start. Sterling, true to his word, had contacted the number André had given him. To his amazement, he was quickly called back by someone offering him a lesson schedule. The first session was free to see if it was a good fit. Sterling accepted, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. His first lesson was a revelation. The instructor, a patient person with decades of experience, didn't treat him as a beginner, but as a potential musician. They worked on basic technique, but also on feeling, on understanding what music could communicate beyond just notes. Sterling left that first session transformed. It wasn't just about learning to play an instrument, it was about finding a voice, a way to express what words couldn't. He promised himself he wouldn't waste this opportunity. Meanwhile, Phoenix began taking careful steps toward her nursing dream. She researched online courses, inquired at local institutions, calculated costs. It was still daunting, but no longer impossible. The stability of their new home gave her the mental space to plan, to dream. River had found work through a contact André had given him. Not the number for the apartment, but another number, discreetly included in a second message. A construction company needed someone with his skills. The interview was fair. Assessment of his abilities based on merit. He got the job. The pay was better than anything he had earned before. The hours stable. It wasn't wealth, but it was security. And security, after years of struggle, felt like luxury. Weeks passed. The initial excitement of the changes began to normalize into a new routine. Phoenix and River found their rhythm in the apartment, got to know their neighbors, created a home from the space. Sage visited often, her fears slowly being replaced by cautious optimism. It was during this period that Phoenix decided to write to André, not to ask for more, but to thank him. She struggled with the words, not wanting to sound needy or excessive. Finally, she kept it simple, a sincere expression of gratitude for what he had done, and an update on how they were doing. She sent the letter to the address the assistant had given her, not knowing if it would ever arrive or if it did, if it would be read. But it felt important to do it, to close the circle in some way. Weeks later, she received a response. It wasn't from André himself, but from his office. A brief note confirming her letter had been received and read. It said André was glad to hear things were going well and wished them the best. There were no further offers, no invitation, no extension of the relationship. For some, this might have been disappointing, but for Phoenix it was perfect. It confirmed what she had hoped, that his help had been genuine, without strings, without expectations. He had made a difference and then moved on, as it should be. River had mixed feelings about the whole experience. Part of him was deeply grateful, but another part felt discomfort about accepting such great help from a stranger. He had been raised to rely on himself, to owe nothing to anyone. This new reality forced him to reconsider those principles. Phoenix, noticing his struggle, talked with him during late evenings after long days. She reminded him that accepting help wasn't weakness, that community and connection often meant leaning on each other, that what André had done came from a place of generosity, not superiority. Slowly, Rieu began to accept. He promised himself that when he was in a position to do so, he would pay it forward. He would help where he could, how he could, not because he owed it to André specifically, but because he now understood the power of an extended hand. Sterling's musical journey progressed steadily. He practiced every day, sometimes until his fingers hurt. The violin, once a forgotten family piece, became his constant companion. His instructor was pleased with his progress, noting that he had a natural feel for the instrument. One day, after a particularly good lesson, the instructor asked Sterling if he would be interested in participating in a small recital. Nothing grand, just students and family, but a chance to perform publicly. Sterling's first reaction was panic, but then he remembered the courtyard, André playing for a small audience without perfection. He agreed. The recital was nerve-wracking but ultimately satisfying. Sterling made mistakes, but he played with heart. The audience, small but supportive, applauded sincerely. Afterward, Sterling felt something he hadn't often experienced: pride, not arrogance, but healthy recognition of effort and progress. These individual threads, Phoenix's studies, Rieu's work, Sterling's music, began weaving together into a larger pattern. The wedding that had started so simply had created ripples that touched multiple lives, each transforming in their own way. Willow, the neighbor, had undergone her own transformation. Inspired by the events of that day, she had begun volunteering at a local community organization. For the first time in years, she felt purpose beyond her own daily routine. She realized her words to Phoenix and Rieu that day hadn't just been for them, but for herself too. The impact of one day, one unexpected encounter, continued to grow. It wasn't dramatic, not cinematic. It was subtle, steady, real, and it was this reality that made it so powerful. Months passed. The lives of Phoenix and Rieu stabilized into a pattern that felt like something they had built, not just survived. The apartment was now truly a home, filled with small personal touches that reflected their shared history. Photos from the wedding, including one blurry shot of André in the background, hung on the walls. Phoenix had enrolled in a nursing program. It was part-time, combined with her work, and the study was intensive. But every evening she opened her books. Every time she learned a new skill, she felt deep satisfaction. This wasn't just a career path. This was fulfillment of a long-held ambition. Rieu flourished in his new work. His skills were recognized and valued. He got a promotion after a few months, not because of who he knew, but because of what he could do. The money was better, but more importantly, the respect was real. He came home tired but satisfied, knowing his day had meant something. Sage, noticing the changes in her daughter and son-in-law, began restructuring her own narrative. She had always seen herself as someone who had withstood circumstances, and that was true. But now she began to see that accepting help, trusting in the goodness of others, was also a form of strength. One evening, when Phoenix, Rieu, and Sage were eating together in the apartment, the conversation naturally returned to the wedding. They remembered details, laughed at the chaos, re-experienced the emotion. But what stood out was that the story was already changing in their memory. Not through forgetfulness, but through perspective. It was no longer about the man who had appeared. It was about the choice to trust, to grasp the offered hand, to take risks based on faith rather than certainty. André had been important, his actions crucial, but what had truly changed the course of their lives was their own decision to say yes. Sterling had followed his own trajectory. The music lessons had become steady routine. He now played regularly at small events, sometimes solo, sometimes as part of a group. The violin that had once been hidden was now an instrument of joy and connection. He had made friends through music, found a community that shared his newfound passion. At one event, Sterling met an older couple who had assisted at many of André Rieu's concerts. They recognized his playing, noted potential. They spoke with him about music, not as a necessary profession, but as a life-enriching activity. Sterling felt seen, not just as a beginning musician, but as a person with value. Willow's volunteer work had diminished her feelings of isolation. She had made connections, had impact in her community. The wedding event had been a turning point, a moment where she had looked at her own life and decided to change. She often mentioned Phoenix and Rieu in her conversations, not as celebrities, but as reminders of courage. Returning to André, his life had continued at its usual pace. Concerts, travel, commitments. The neighborhood wedding was one of many moments in a busy existence. He remembered it, of course, the sincerity, the simplicity, the need and hope he had seen. But it wasn't a defining incident for him. He had helped countless people over the years, sometimes with grand gestures, often with small ones. For him, it wasn't calculation of karmic points or publicity stunt. It was just a way of being, a response to what he saw and felt. Phoenix's letter had touched him, reminded him why he sometimes made these choices, but he felt no need for further involvement. 1 year after the wedding, Phoenix and River were home on a quiet evening when an unexpected package arrived. There was no return address, only a small card. The package contained a photo, a professional print of the wedding. No one remembered a photographer, but there it was, a perfectly captured moment of Phoenix and River hand in hand, with guests around them, simple decorations visible, and in a corner, blurry but recognizable, André with the violin. The card said simply, "For your home, may it remember what's possible. AR." It was a simple gesture, but it touched them deeply. They hung the photo in a prominent place, not as a memento of celebrity, but as a symbol of their journey, their choice, their transformation. Phoenix completed her first semester with high grades. Her instructors noticed her dedication, her natural empathy, her skill. They didn't know her background, the struggle to get there. They saw only a talented student with potential, and that was enough. River had saved enough to start a small project, something of his own, a renovation service. Small but honest, he remembered his promise to himself to pay it forward. He began by offering comparable work at cost-effective rates for families struggling as he once had. His first project was for a widow who needed repairs but couldn't afford them. River did the work at minimal cost, just enough to cover materials. The woman cried with gratitude. River felt an echo of his own experience, being on the receiving end of help. Now he was the giver. The circle had closed. Sterling was asked to teach young students, passing his knowledge forward. The idea seemed overwhelming at first, but his instructor assured him he was ready. His first student was a nervous 10-year-old who reminded Sterling of himself a year ago. The connection was immediate. Learning by teaching, Sterling found his musical voice further strengthened. Sage, retired and with more free time, began volunteering at a local church, helping organize events for families in need. She used her own experiences, her own understanding of struggle to guide others. She became a source of wisdom and support in her community. The original wedding guests stayed in touch, not consistently, but with a special bond. They gathered occasionally, sharing stories, updates. The wedding was a shared memory, but more than that, it was a shared turning point. Everyone had followed their own path afterward, but that moment had touched them all. On the second anniversary of their wedding, Phoenix and River organized a small gathering. The same courtyard, now somewhat improved by the owner who had been inspired by their story. The same people, most of them. Sterling brought his violin, played for them. A return to that magical day, but now his playing was skilled, confident. Progress was clear. During the gathering, everyone shared their stories from the past year. Successes, challenges, growth. The pattern was clear. The events of that one day had laid a foundation, but what happened afterward was their own doing. They had made choices, taken risks, worked hard. Willow stood and made a toast. She spoke about courage, about seizing opportunities, about trusting in goodness. Her words weren't about André, though he was mentioned. They were about everyone present, about their collective journey. Phoenix and River listened, their hands joined, their eyes often meeting. They had come a long way from that simple wedding. They now had a home, careers, hope, but they never forgot the starting place, the help they had received, the choice they had made to trust. Later that evening, alone in their apartment, Phoenix and River reflected on the year. They acknowledged their life wasn't perfect, the challenges remained, that the future was uncertain. But they had tools now, stability, foundation. They had learned that asking for help wasn't weak, that accepting help was possible without losing self-worth, that paying forward was a powerful principle. The photo of their wedding, with André's blurry silhouette, caught their eye. They remembered not just his actions but his words, often repeated, "Choices are yours." Those words had become a constant reminder. They were empowered not by what they had been given, but by what they had chosen to do with it. In another part of the city, André Rieu continued his life. He played, he traveled, he connected with audiences worldwide. Sometimes he thought about the simple wedding, the genuine people, the small impact that had rippled outward. It gave him satisfaction, but also reminded him of his own purpose. He had learned long ago that fame and success without connection to humanity were hollow. Moments like that wedding, unexpected and unscripted, reminded him why he made music, why he continued performing. It wasn't for applause or income, it was for connection, for shared human experience. The stories of Phoenix, River, Sterling, Sage, Willow, and many others intertwined into a tapestry of interconnected lives, all touched by one day, one choice to stop, listen, and act. It wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was real life, with all its complexity and ongoing struggle. But what it had demonstrated was the power of small actions, of genuine help, of choices made with courage. A wedding without money for a band had been transformed, not by adding wealth or luxury, but by introducing hope, possibility, and a reminder that goodness exists. 5 years later, the ripple effects continued to expand in ways none of them could have imagined that day in the courtyard. Phoenix had not only completed her nursing degree, but had become head nurse at a children's hospital, where she implemented programs for underprivileged families. Her experience of receiving unexpected help had shaped her approach to patient care, always looking for ways to support families beyond just medical treatment. River's small renovation business had grown into a non-profit organization that provided free home repairs for elderly and disabled residents. He had trained a team of young people, many from backgrounds similar to his own, giving them both skills and purpose. The organization was named Second Chances Renovations, a direct nod to the opportunity he had received. Sterling had become more than just an accomplished violinist. He had opened a music school in the same neighborhood where the wedding had taken place, offering free lessons to children whose families couldn't afford them. The school had grown to include multiple instruments and employed several teachers, all committed to Sterling's philosophy that music should be accessible to everyone. The old violin that had started it all was now displayed in the school's entrance, with a plaque telling its story. Students would often ask about it, and Sterling would share the tale of how one moment of courage to play imperfectly had changed his life forever. Sage had become a community organizer, helping to establish a network of support services for families facing housing instability. Her own experience watching her daughter's struggles had given her insight into the gaps in social services. She worked tirelessly to connect families with resources, often thinking about how different things might have been if André hadn't appeared that day. Willow had started a neighborhood watch program that wasn't about security, but about connection. She organized regular community gatherings, skill-sharing workshops, and support networks. Her transformation from an isolated neighbor to a community leader was remarkable to those who had known her before. The assistant who had helped Phoenix and River with the apartment had been so moved by their story that she had started her own initiative connecting musicians with community events. She realized that what André had done, bringing music to unexpected places, could be replicated on a smaller scale throughout the city. Pavel, André's driver, had been quietly inspired by that day as well. He had begun volunteering to drive elderly residents to medical appointments, remembering how a simple detour had led to such meaningful impact. Even the courtyard where the wedding had taken place had been transformed. The owner, touched by the story and the positive attention it brought to the community center, had renovated the space and made it available at no cost to couples who couldn't afford traditional wedding venues. A small plaque by the entrance read, "Where love begins, miracles follow." André himself had established a small foundation that provided grants for wedding couples in financial need, remembering the power of celebrating love regardless of economic circumstances. He never publicized the foundation widely, preferring to let local community organizations nominate deserving couples. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Phoenix and River returned to the now beautiful courtyard for a renewal of their vows. This time, they could afford anything they wanted, but they chose simplicity again, not from necessity, but from understanding what truly mattered. The gathering was larger now, including not just the original wedding guests, but also the young people River had trained, families Phoenix had helped through the hospital, Sterling's music students, and many others whose lives had been touched by the expanding circle of that one day's impact. Sterling played again, this time with a small ensemble of his students. The music was more sophisticated now, but it carried the same heart, the same hope that had filled the air that first day. As Phoenix and River renewed their vows, they spoke not just of their love for each other, but of their gratitude for learning that accepting help was the beginning of being able to give it. They had discovered that vulnerability could lead to strength, that trust could create miracles, and that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of kindness. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and shared stories, an unexpected message arrived, a simple card from André, who was performing on another continent. It read, "To Phoenix and River, may your ripples continue to reach shores you've never imagined. The music you make together is the most beautiful of all. AR." The card was passed around, read by many, but what struck everyone wasn't the celebrity connection. It was the reminder that they were all part of something larger than themselves, a network of care and possibility that had grown from one moment of unexpected grace. As the sun set over the courtyard, Phoenix and River stood surrounded by their community, the original and the extended, the given and the chosen. They had learned that fairy tales weren't just stories of Prince Charmings and magic spells, but real-life accounts of ordinary people who chose to believe in extraordinary possibilities. Their wedding without money for a band had become legendary in their neighborhood, not because of who had appeared, but because of who they had all chosen to become afterward. It was a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful music isn't heard, but lived, not performed but embodied, not applauded but passed on. In the end, the true magic hadn't been in André's violin playing, beautiful as it was. The magic had been in the decision to open doors when opportunities knocked, to trust in goodness when cynicism seemed safer, and to use blessing received as fuel for blessing others. As they looked around at the faces of their extended community, young and old, struggling and thriving, all connected by threads of kindness and possibility, Phoenix and River knew that their story would continue rippling outward in ways they might never fully know, carrying the simple truth that love shared multiplies, kindness compounds, and sometimes, when we least expect it, a broken radio can lead to the most beautiful music of all.